Tonight we are standing in a small side room off a great hall at the end of a long evening, and there is very little light. The fire in the hall next door has been banked down, and the glow of it comes through the doorway in a low orange band across the floor. Somebody has moved the lamps. The room we are in has a bench, a stool, a stack of folded cloths, and a large bronze basin standing on the floor with steam coming off the surface of it in slow threads. Cold water first, then hot poured in from a jug. That was the order because the bronze would crack if you filled it wrong, and everyone knew it, and nobody thought about it. There are two people here. One is an old woman kneeling. She is somewhere past 70, and her hands have done this 10,000 times, and she is not looking at what she is doing because she is talking. The other is a man sitting on a low stool with his back to the fire and one foot over the basin, and he has arranged himself quite deliberately so that his leg is in shadow. She has the cloth in the water. She is talking about somebody who went away a long time ago and never came back, and she is saying that this stranger, whoever he is, reminds her of him. The same build, the same feet, something about the voice. Her hands go up over the ankle, over the shin, onto the thigh, and they stop. We are going to stay in this room for a while, and we are going to leave it entirely and go a very long way away, and then we are going to come back to this exact instant with her hands where they are in the water not yet spilled. Because that is what the poem does, and it is the most famous piece of construction in European literature. And people have been arguing about why for 2,500 years. Let yourself settle wherever you are. Nothing here is frightening. It is warm and it is quiet. And it is mostly a story about a boy on a mountain and a very old woman with good hands. If these long nights help you sleep, a like is what keeps this small channel findable by other people lying awake at this hour. And I like knowing where you are. Put your town and the time on your clock in the comments, and I will read it in the morning. Now, before we go anywhere, who is kneeling on that floor? Her name is Euryclea, and she has been in that house longer than anybody else alive in it. The poem tells you exactly how she got there, and it does it in the middle of this scene, in the same breath, because it cannot bear to introduce anybody without their whole history. She was bought as a girl, bought, that is the word, by the old master of the house, for the price of 20 oxen, which was a great deal. And then it says something that we should be careful with, because it is easy to sentimentalize and easy to flatten. He honored her in his halls equally with his own faithful wife, and never touched her, avoiding the anger of his wife. That is the poem being scrupulous about a real and ugly situation. A young woman bought into a household had no protection at all, except the decency of the man who bought her. And the poem records that this particular man behaved decently, and it records it in a way that makes very clear that this was worth mentioning. She stayed. She nursed the son of that house, took him from his mother, and fed him and carried him, and he grew up on her hip. Then, 40 years later, she nursed his son the same way. She is not a servant in the sense we would mean it. She is nothing like free, and she is also the person who holds the keys to the storerooms, who counts the linen, who runs 50 women, and who has the standing to tell the young master of the house to stop being a fool. She is also, and this is the part that matters tonight, the only person in the building who has handled this man's body since he was an infant. Not seen him, handled him, washed him, dried him, dressed him, held him when he was ill, put him to bed. A face can be aged past recognition in 20 years. A voice can be roughened, but she knows him the way you know the weight of your own child, and that is not a kind of knowledge that lives in the eyes. Which is why, of everybody in that house, she is the one he should have been most careful about. And he was careless. That is the thing. The cleverest man alive, 4 days into the most sustained deception of his life, in a house full of people who want him dead, and he agrees to have his feet washed by the woman who raised him. Here is how it comes about, and it comes about because he says the wrong thing. He is in the hall, on the floor by the doorpost, at the end of the long conversation with the mistress of the house that we followed on another night. the one with the clothes and the golden brooch, and the dream about the geese. And she offers him the ordinary courtesy, a bed and a washing, and he refuses the first part of it. No soft blankets, no coverlets, he says. He has slept on bad bedding for years and can do it again. And then he refuses the washing too, on the grounds that no young woman of the household is going to touch his feet. Unless, he says, there happens to be some old woman here, somebody careful, who has borne as much in her heart as I have. If there is one like that, I would not object to her handling my feet. Look at what he has just done. He has produced out of nowhere a very specific specification for the one person in that house who is capable of recognizing him. And he has done it out of what looks like courtesy and is probably tiredness. Because there is such a woman, and everybody knows who she is, and the mistress of the house says so at once. There is an old servant here who nursed him and held him from the hour he was born. And it is worth knowing what the washing meant, because it is not hygiene. Feet were washed for a guest as the formal act of reception. Everywhere in these poems and in the world they describe, a stranger arrives. He is seated, he is fed, and at some point, before he sleeps, water is brought and his feet are washed, usually by a servant, sometimes by a daughter of the house. Once, in a famous scene on a foreign island, by handmaids who also give him oil and a tunic and a cloak. It is the moment the dust of the road is taken off, and with it, the status of stranger. After the washing, you are a guest, and the household is responsible for you. So when the mistress of that house offers it to a filthy beggar sitting on her doorsill, she is not being fastidious. She is formally receiving him, extending the full protection of the house to a man everybody else in the room has been throwing things at, which is why he cannot refuse the whole thing without insulting her. He can only redirect it. And the old woman gets up and comes over. And this is where it starts to hurt. She stands in front of him with the basin in her hands. And instead of kneeling straight down, she talks, the way old people talk when something has caught them. And what she says is this: I will wash your feet, both for her sake and for yours. My heart is stirred by your troubles. Many worn-out strangers have come to this house, but I say I have never seen anyone so like him. Your build and your voice and your feet, they are his. And he answers her evenly, without a flicker. Yes, everyone who has seen us both says we are very like each other. Then he sits down, and the poem gives one line of stage direction that is worth the whole scene, and it goes past most readers on a first pass because it is so quick. He turned himself quickly toward the darkness, not away from her, toward the dark part of the room so that the fire is behind him. Because a thought has just arrived, the poem says so directly, that she might take hold of the scar as she washed, and that it would all come out. That is the moment his entire 20-year plan becomes a question of where a person is sitting relative to a fire. He is too late, and it does not help, because she is not going to see it. Feel the water. She pours cold in first, and then adds the hot from the jug, and the sound changes as the level rises. That deepening note a filling vessel makes, which is the same in every kitchen, in every century. She takes his foot in both hands. The water is hot enough that he lifts his foot back out for a second, the way everyone does, and then lets it down. She works upward. Wet cloth over the ankle bone, both thumbs into the arch, the flat of her hand up the shin, and she is telling him something now about the boy she raised, that he was quick, and that he asked too many questions, and that his grandfather came down for the naming, and her hands go over the knee onto the outside of the thigh, and the palm crosses a ridge of raised tissue about the length of a hand, running at an angle, hard where the rest of him is soft. And she stops. And the poem stops. Because at that exact instant, with an old woman's fingers resting on it and a basin of hot water between them, and neither of them having said a word, the story turns round and walks away, and does not come back for 70 lines. That is the passage we are going to spend tonight inside. It is the single most discussed digression in world literature, and where it goes is up a mountain 40 years earlier in the rain. So, the scar the boar gave him. Go back to before he was born, to an old man in the high country of central Greece, on the slopes of a mountain sacred to the god of prophecy, in a stone house with a courtyard at a considerable altitude. That is his mother's father, and he is a specialist. The poem describes him without embarrassment as the man who surpassed everybody in thievery and in the swearing of oaths. And it says he had this as a gift from a god, from the Quick One, the guide of travelers and traders and thieves, who liked him because he burned him good offerings. There are stories about him that were told all over Greece. He stole cattle and altered the marks on their hooves so the tracks led the wrong way. He could make white animals black and hornless ones horned, or so people said. He was caught exactly once by a man who had thought further ahead than he had and marked his own animal's hooves with letters so that the ground itself printed the thief's name. That is the grandfather. And when a boy was born to his daughter, down on the island, they sent for him. He came, and there was a meal, and afterwards the nurse, the same woman, 40 years younger, kneeling on a floor with a baby in her arms, put the child on his knees and said, "Give him a name. This is the child of your child, the one you prayed for." And what he said was not a blessing. He said, "I have come here as a man who has been angry with a great many people over the wide earth. So let the boy be called for that." The name he gave is the name we know, and it is built on a Greek verb about anger and hatred and the giving of pain, and it works in both directions grammatically, the one who causes trouble and the one to whom trouble is caused. Both turned out to be true, at enormous length. The poem plays with that name for 24 books. It is the great pun of the poem, and every Greek listener heard it every time the name was said, in the way that we would hear a person called sorrow or trouble. And having named him for anger, the old man said the thing that puts everything else in motion, "Send him up to me when he is grown, and I will give him presents." And there is a shadow over that grandfather that we should look at, because it touches the man's identity even more directly than the scar does. In some accounts, that old thief was not merely gifted by the god of thieves. He was his son. That is the line taken by several later writers, and it makes the family tree read very differently. The trickster god, then the master thief, then the daughter, then the boy. 3 generations of the same talent, arriving in a child who would grow up to be the cleverest liar in the world, with the whole thing explained by descent, which is tidy. And then there is the other tradition, which is not tidy at all, because there was a story, and it was old enough that the Athenian tragedians used it on stage as an insult, that the boy's father was not the king of that island at all. The thief, it was said, had once stolen cattle from a certain king in the south, the famous one, the one who ended up pushing a stone up a hill forever, and had altered the hooves so the tracks led the wrong way. And the king had thought further ahead than he had, and marked his own animals underneath, so that when he came looking, the ground had his name printed in it. He got his cattle back, and in some tellings, he took something else as well, in the thief's own house, and the child of that night was raised on an island as the son of a different man. So there is a version of this hero in which he is not who he says he is at the root, where the very first thing about him is a false attribution. The poem we have knows nothing about it, and says so implicitly at every turn. It is fiercely committed to the father on the farm, but the alternative was circulating, and dramatists reached for it whenever they wanted to make him look bad, which was often. I mention it because of what tonight is about. A man whose whole life is a series of assumed identities, whose name means trouble, who is finally pinned down by a mark on his leg. And even his parentage has a rival version. Everything about him can be argued with, except the scar. He goes when he is somewhere in his teens. The poem does not give an age. The impression is of a boy who has just become worth taking hunting. Picture where he is going, because the mountain is a real one, and it is not a small thing. It is the great limestone mass in the middle of the country, over 8,000 feet, snow on it for months, with 2 summits and a long shoulder running east. From the top of it, on a clear day, you can see across most of southern Greece. On its southern flank, on a terrace above a gorge, there was a sanctuary that within a few centuries of this story would become the most important religious site in the Greek world. The place people came from every corner of the Mediterranean to ask questions, where cities kept their treasuries, and where a stone stood that was said to be the one a certain god swallowed instead of his son. Above it, the cliffs go up in two enormous faces that catch the light at the end of the day and turn the color of a peach. And behind and above all of that, the country the hunt takes place in. Dense forest on the lower slopes, oak and fir, with folded ravines full of scrub and springs and caves. One of them enormous, high up, sacred to the god of wine and to the mountain nymphs, where women went in winter with torches. That is where a boy from a small poor island is being sent on his own to be given presents by a grandfather with a reputation. Feel the arrival, because it is one of the warmest scenes in the poem, and it lasts about 10 lines. He comes up into the high country, and the whole household comes out to meet him, uncles, cousins, the old man himself, and they take his hands and say the things people say, and his grandmother kisses his face and both his eyes, and the old man tells his sons to get a meal ready, and they do. They bring in a 5-year-old bull and skin it and joint it and put it on the spits and cook it carefully and divide the portions, and everybody eats until nobody wants any more. That is the whole of the welcome, and it takes no time at all in the telling, and it is completely convincing. An old thief's house, high up, full of grown sons, delighted to have the grandson visiting. They sit until the sun goes down and then go to bed. And the boy sleeps in a strange house in the mountains, with the shutters open and the cold coming in, and hears whatever you hear up there at night. An owl, dogs somewhere below, the wind coming through the pines in long passes. Then the dawn. This is where the poem's language goes taut. And I want to give you the morning properly, because it is the best hunting scene in Greek literature, and it is over in about 30 lines. They go out early with the dogs, before the light has fully come, uphill first, into the folded ground on the side of the mountain, and then into the woods. The ground is soaked. It is that hour when the dew is still on everything, and the leaf mold underfoot is dark and holds a print, and the smell of it is deep and sour sweet. Wet oak leaves, rotted down over years, cold underneath. The dogs are out in front, working the ground, ranging left and right with their noses down, and their breath is showing. The sun comes up out of the sea. The poem says exactly that. On a mountain in the middle of Greece, the sun struck the fields, rising from the deep, softly flowing stream of the ocean. And then they come to a hollow, and in the hollow there is a thicket. This is the detail that has been quoted more than any other in the whole poem, and it is 4 lines long. The thicket is so dense that the wet force of the winds does not blow through it, and the bright sun does not strike it with its rays, and the rain does not get through, so thick it is. And there is a great heap of dead leaves inside it. Nothing gets in there. Not wind, not light, not water. Something is lying in the middle of that. He hears them first, the sound of feet, of men and dogs, coming up the slope. And you should picture the animal properly, because a Mediterranean wild boar is not a pig. It is a barrel of muscle on short legs, chest high on a man, with bristles like wire and a hide across the shoulders, so thick that hunters described it as armor, and 2 curved tusks in the lower jaw that are kept razor sharp by grinding against the upper ones every time it closes its mouth. It does not charge to knock you down. It comes in low and turns its head sideways as it passes, and the tusk does the rest. He comes out of the thicket with his bristles up and fire in his eyes. That is the poem's phrase. And he stands there facing them at very close range. And the boy goes first. That is what the poem records. He rushed forward, holding the long spear high in his heavy hand, eager to strike. And the boar got there first. He came in from the side, above the knee, and tore a long piece of flesh away with a sideways rip of the tusk, and did not reach the bone. And the boy killed him. Through the right shoulder, and the point went straight through, and the animal went down in the leaves screaming, and his life went out of him. Then the uncles arrive, and here is where the scene turns from a hunt into something else entirely. And it is the reason I wanted to tell this story on this particular kind of night. They bandage him. Skillfully, the poem says, "These are men who have dealt with this before, on this mountain, with dogs and boars, more than once." And then they stop the bleeding with a song. The word is a specific one. It means a thing sung over, an incantation, a charm, sung across a wound, and it is the ordinary Greek word from which we eventually get our word for an ode. There is no shame in it, and no magic ceremony described. Somebody kneels down in the wet leaves next to a bleeding boy and sings the right words over the leg, and the blood stops, and they carry him back down to the house. That is not a fairy tale detail dropped in by a poet. Charms for stopping blood are attested all over the ancient world and long after it, in Greek magical papyri, in Roman farming manuals, in medieval leech books, in folk practice in Europe and in America, into living memory. Whole families held the words and passed them to one child. Where the older commentators saw only a bit of color, more recent readers have pointed out that this is one of the very few places in these poems where we get a plain look at ordinary medicine. Bind the wound, sing the charm, practiced by non-specialists in the field without a god in sight. It is worth sitting with the wound for a moment because the poem is precise about it in a way that mattered enormously to anyone listening. The tusk took flesh and did not reach the bone. That distinction is the difference between a scar and a death. A deep thigh wound in that world could go one of several ways. It could bleed out in minutes if it went where the big vessels run. It could reach the bone and become an infection that no one could treat. Or it could take a slab of muscle, bleed frighteningly, and heal. He got the third one. The poem tells you so immediately, and an audience that had watched wounds heal and fail to heal for their whole lives would have relaxed at exactly that word. What they did for him afterwards is the standard of the day, and we know it from the other poem, which is full of battlefield medicine. Wash it out, get the object or the fragments out if there are any, bind it with a woolen bandage, and put something on it. Bitter root scraped in one scene. Warm wine to clean it. Honey, which was used on wounds all over the ancient world for thousands of years, and which turns out, when modern people got round to testing it, to be genuinely antibacterial. There were two brothers with the army at Troy who were surgeons, sons of the god of healing in the poems, and treated as enormously valuable men. One of them is wounded at one point, and there is a line about how a healer is worth many other men because he can cut out arrows and put soothing things on. And then the singing, both together, always. That is the thing modern readers find strange, and it is not strange at all. The physical treatment and the charm were not alternatives. They were the same procedure. You bound the wound properly, and you said the words over it because you did not know which part was working, and there was no reason to leave either out. Nobody in that hollow thought they were doing magic instead of medicine. They were doing everything they had. He gets better. They fill him with presents, exactly as promised, and send him home. And his mother and father are delighted, and they ask him how he got the scar. And he tells them the whole thing. And that sentence, the boy telling the story at home, is where the digression stops, and the poem swings back with no warning at all to a small dark room in a house on an island 40 years later, where an old woman's hand is still resting on the mark. The old woman took it in the flat of her hands and knew it. That is the line. Not saw, took hold of, felt, and recognized. And she let the foot go. The leg dropped into the basin. The bronze rang. That is in the poem. The vessel gave out a note when the leg fell into it. And it tipped, and the water went across the floor in a sheet and spread, and steam came up off the stones. And the poem says that joy and grief seized her heart at the same instant, and both her eyes filled with tears, and her strong voice was stopped. Joy and grief together, not one after the other. She got a hand up toward his chin, which is not affection. That is the gesture of a suppliant, the formal appeal you make when you take hold of somebody and put yourself under their protection. And she got out the words, "You are Odysseus, dear child, and I did not know you until I had touched all of my master's body." And she turned her head to look across the room at his wife, who is sitting a few feet away, wanting to signal to her that her husband is in the house. And he moved. He got his right hand on her throat and pulled her toward him with the other, and what he says is one of the coldest speeches in the poem. "Mother, why do you want to destroy me? You nursed me at your own breast, and now I have come back in the 20th year to my own country. But since you know, and a God has put it in your mind, be quiet, and let nobody else in this house learn of it. Or I tell you plainly, and it will be done, that if a God puts the others into my hands, I will not spare you either, nurse though you are." She promises. She says his heart is hard and unyielding, which it is, and that she will hold as firm as stone or iron. He lets go, and then she gets up and goes to fetch more water, because the first lot is all over the floor. That is the detail I cannot get past. The most charged recognition in the poem ends with an old woman going out to refill a basin and coming back and finishing the job and rubbing him with oil, and him pulling his rags across the leg and turning back toward the fire, and his wife, 6 feet away, notices none of it. The poem gives an explanation that the goddess turned her mind aside, and you can take that at face value, or you can hear it as a door being left open. That is a question we spent another whole night on, and I will not reopen it here. Notice too what the poem does not give her. She is the first human being to know he is home, and she gets no speech about it. There is no scene where she sits down and tells him what the last 20 years were like in that house. No reunion, no questions answered. She gets 4 lines, a hand at her throat, a threat, and an instruction to fetch more water. And she takes it, because she has spent 70 years in a household where that is what happens, and because the man saying it is the child she carried, and both of those things are true at once, and neither cancels the other. The poem is quite unsentimental about this. It does not tell you to feel sorry for her, and it does not pretend the moment is warm. It simply records that joy and grief arrived together in the same instant, and that the second one was, at least partly, about him, because she has just learned that the boy she raised has come home as a man who will put a hand on her windpipe to keep a plan intact. Both of those are in that room, in the dark, with the water on the floor. Now, why does the poem do that? Why, at the exact instant of maximum tension, does it walk away for 70 lines to tell you about a boy's grandfather and a thicket on a mountain and how the bleeding was stopped, and then come back to the same second with the water not yet spilled? That question has an answer that is more famous than the passage itself, and it comes from a book written in the strangest circumstances imaginable. A famous essay from the middle of the last century opens with exactly this scene, and the essay is called After the Scar. It was written by a German scholar of Romance languages who had been removed from his university post because he was Jewish, and who had left the country and was living in Istanbul during the Second World War, teaching, cut off, working with almost no research library. He says as much in the closing pages, and notes that the book could not have been written if he had had access to all the specialist literature, because he would have been buried in it and never written a word. So he wrote about texts he knew by heart, from memory, in exile, while everything he came from was being destroyed. And he began with a foot being washed. His argument is this: Homer's style leaves nothing in the dark. Everything is brought to the surface, fully lit, evenly illuminated, with all the connections spelled out. Objects have histories, people have genealogies, gestures get described, and nothing is allowed to remain in the background as unexplained depth. The digression on this reading is not there to build suspense. It is there because the poet cannot bear an unexplained object. A scar has appeared. A scar has an origin. The origin must be told completely now before anything else can happen. And the telling is so total, so present, that while you are on that mountain, the room with the basin does not exist at all. And he set that against a different kind of writing, from the same broad period and a very different tradition. The story of a father taking his son up a mountain to sacrifice him in the Hebrew Bible. There, he says, almost nothing is described. We are not told what the sky looked like, or what anyone was wearing, or what they were thinking. There is a journey of 3 days in a single sentence. The characters have depths that are never opened, and the silence in the text is not a gap to be filled. It is the point. The story is, in his phrase, fraught with background. 2 ways of making a world out of words. 1, where everything is foreground, and 1, where almost everything is withheld. It is one of the great openings of any work of criticism, and generations of students have met this passage about a bronze basin because of it. It has been pointed out more than once, and with some force, that he was wrong about the suspense, because the effect on an actual listener is unmistakable. You are told that the hands have found the scar, and then you are made to wait through a hunting trip. If that is not retardation, nothing is. And the poem uses the technique elsewhere in ways that are hard to explain any other way. There is a case, made by several scholars, that the poet knew exactly what he was doing, and that a 70-line delay at that precise moment is craft of the highest order, and that reading it as an inability to leave things in shadow is a 19th century idea about primitive epic imposed on a very sophisticated poem. I think both are partly right, and that the argument itself is the reason this passage has stayed alive. A story stops at the worst possible moment and goes for a walk on a mountain. Whatever the poet's reason, the fact is the same. 3,000 years later, we are still standing in that room with the water about to go over, waiting to be let back in. There is a technical term for the thing the passage is doing, and it comes from 2 German poets sitting down at the end of the 18th century to work out what makes an epic different from a play. They decided the difference was delay. A drama drives forward, everything in it pushes toward the end, and anything that does not is a fault. An epic, they argued, does the opposite. It keeps finding reasons to slow down, to open a side door, to describe a shield for 130 lines, or follow a spear back to the tree it was cut from. They called these retarding elements, and they thought them essential rather than accidental. The pleasure of an epic is partly the pleasure of not arriving. That idea has been in the toolkit ever since, and it is the strongest reply to the reading that says the digression is simply a poet unable to leave a scar unexplained. Because if delay is a structural principle of the form, if the poem is built to wander, then this is not a failure of shadow. It is the technique at its most concentrated, deployed at the single most loaded moment available. And the 2 readings do not actually cancel out. It is entirely possible for a style to bring everything into the light, and for that same style to know precisely when a long, bright, fully lit journey up a mountain will be unbearable to sit through. Editors in antiquity had opinions too, and marked passages, and quarreled about which lines were genuine. That is the oldest continuous argument in literature, and it has never stopped. What nobody argues about is the effect of the object itself. Because a scar is a very particular kind of evidence, and the Greeks had a word for the moment it produces, anagnorisis, recognition, literally a knowing again. It became a technical term in the study of drama, and the philosopher who wrote the first surviving book on how plays work put it near the center of everything. The change from not knowing to knowing, which, when it lands at the same moment as a reversal of fortune, is what makes an audience feel something. And he graded them. There are better and worse kinds of recognition, he said, and he put them in order. And the lowest kind, the crudest, the least artistic, is recognition by signs and tokens. Birthmarks, necklaces, a ring left in a basket, the stuff of stage comedy for 2,000 years. And then, remarkably, he names this exact passage as the exception that shows how to do it properly. He notes that in this poem, the scar is used twice, in 2 different scenes, and that the 2 are not equally good, because in one the man chooses to show it, and in the other, it is discovered against his will, while he is doing something else entirely. The involuntary one is better. That is the judgment, made about 2,500 years ago, and it is exactly right. And it is why the basin scene is the one everybody remembers. Which brings us to the other one, and to a small piece of theater out in a farmyard. A day or so later, he is outside, on the land, with 2 of his own men. The man who keeps the pigs, who has already fed him and sheltered him, and given him his own cloak when he was nobody, and the man who keeps the cattle. He needs them for what is coming. 2 men against a hall full of aristocrats is not a plan. 4 is barely 1. But it is what there is. So he tests them first, obliquely, with a question about what they would do if their master came back. And when the answers are the right answers, he tells them. And then he says, "Here is the proof." And he pulls back the rags and shows them the leg. Same object, completely different act. In the small room, it was taken from him. Out in the yard, he hands it over deliberately as a credential, the way you would produce a seal or a token. And the 2 men fall on his neck and weep, and he has to tell them to stop before somebody comes out of the house and sees. That is the arc of this whole story in one image. The thing that betrayed him becomes the thing he uses. He has spent his life inventing identities. He is beaten for the only time by 3 inches of scar tissue that he did not choose and cannot remove. And within a day, he has turned it into an instrument, because that is what he does with everything. The scene was popular with the painters too, and one object in particular is worth knowing about. There is a drinking cup from Etruria made in the 5th century before our era that shows it directly. A bearded man sitting with 1 foot raised over a basin, and an old woman kneeling and reaching for his leg, and behind them a couple of onlookers. It is one of the earliest surviving illustrations of any scene from this poem, and the painter has labeled the figures, as they often did. And the name he has given the old woman is not the name in the poem we read. He calls her something else entirely, which tells you something useful about how these stories actually lived. There was not one fixed text sitting on a shelf that everybody consulted. There were versions, sung, told, painted, performed, differing by region and by generation. And a painter in Italy could know this scene perfectly well, down to the basin and the raised foot, and use a different name for the woman doing the washing, because that was the name in the version he had heard. The poem we have is one crystallization of a much larger, much noisier body of storytelling, and every so often an object comes out of the ground and reminds us of it. And it is worth noticing how many recognitions there are in this poem, and how few of them work the way you would expect. The dog knows him instantly, from across a yard, and the whole thing takes about 15 lines, and is, by common consent, the most efficient piece of heartbreak in ancient literature. He is lying on a heap of dung outside the gate, the manure that has been piled up ready to be carted onto the fields, which is exactly where an old farm dog would lie because it is warm. He is covered in ticks. He is not fed. He was bred and trained by the man now standing at the gate, and the man went away before he ever got to hunt him. And he lifts his head and lowers his ears and moves his tail and cannot get up. His master looks at him and turns his face away and wipes his eye, hiding it from the man he is walking with, and asks a deliberately neutral question about whether the dog was ever any good, or was just one of those animals kept around the table for show. And the swineherd, not knowing who he is talking to, says, "This is the dog of a man who died far from here." If he were what he was when his master left him for Troy, you would be amazed at his speed and his strength. Nothing he chased in the deep woods ever got away from him. But now he is in a bad way, and the women do not look after him, because servants stop doing their work when the master is not there to make them. Then he goes into the house, and the dog dies, having seen his master in the 20th year. No token, no test, no interrogation. 20 years, and a smell, and an animal that had nothing to gain by being right. The nurse knows him by touch, in the dark from a scar. The 2 farmhands are shown the evidence and accept it. His son is not permitted to recognize him at all. The boy is simply told in a hut, after a goddess has changed his father's appearance back for a few minutes, and he does not believe it, and thinks he is being tricked by a god, and has to be persuaded. His wife refuses every one of those methods. The scar means nothing to her. She tests him with something no one else on earth could know, and gets an answer only her husband could give. And his father, the old man out on the farm in a dirty tunic and patched leggings and a goatskin cap, digging around a plant when they find him, gets the last and gentlest one. Even there, the son cannot help himself. He tries a false story first, one more invented identity, on a man in his 80s who has already lost everything. And when the old man goes down on his knees in the dirt and pours dust over his own head, the son finally breaks and says who he is. And the old man asks for proof. So he shows him the scar. And then, because a scar is not enough for a father, he gives him the other thing. He says, I will tell you the trees. You gave them to me in this garden when I was a little boy following you around asking for everything, and you named them as we went. 13 pear trees, 10 apple trees, 40 fig trees, and 50 rows of vines, each ripening at a different time, so that the grapes came in one after another all through the season, and the old man's knees give way. That is the same test as the bed, and the same test as the scar, in a third form. Not a token that can be shown. A piece of the world that two people made together, in one place, that could not be known by anybody who was not there. Some traditions claim there was more to that garden, and later writers added detail nobody can check. What survives, and what matters, is the shape of it, a man proving he is himself by counting fruit trees for his father in a garden they planted 40 years earlier. Now step back from the poem for a moment, because the hunt itself has been read in a way that changes what it is doing there. Look at the sequence again as a whole. A boy is sent, at about the right age, away from his father's house to his mother's father, in the mountains at a distance. He is received and fed. He goes out with the men into wild country, faces a dangerous animal alone, kills it, and is wounded in the process. He is treated, given gifts, and sent home, and he comes back with a mark on his body and a story to tell about how he got it. That is not a hunting anecdote. That is the shape of an initiation, and it is a shape that turns up all over the ancient Mediterranean and far beyond it. The pattern has a name in the study of these things. The young man leaves the settled world, goes out to the margin. The mountain, the forest, the wild, undergoes a test that involves real danger, is marked, and returns as something he was not before. The details fit almost too neatly. The maternal grandfather, which in a great many societies is precisely who handles a boy's transition. The wilderness location. The boar specifically, which in that part of the world was the initiation animal. There were places where a young man could not take his seat among the adults or wear certain things until he had killed one. And the wound in the thigh, which recurs in this kind of story with a frequency that scholars have noticed and argued about at length. There is a school of interpretation that reads the whole passage that way and finds it fully coherent. The naming, the journey, the ordeal, the mark, the return. The scar is not an accident that happens to be memorable. It is the physical certificate of the day he stopped being a child, which is why, in that dark room 40 years later, it is the one thing that cannot be argued with. Others are more cautious and point out that boys did get hurt hunting constantly and that the poem may simply be reporting the ordinary way an aristocratic teenager acquired a scar. Both can be true. Real customs are usually the origin of the pattern rather than its imitation, and once you start looking, the boar keeps doing this. It is the animal that wounds young men in Greek myth, and it wounds them in the same place, and the pattern is too consistent to be an accident of nature. The most famous hunt in the tradition is the one in the west of Greece, where a king forgot to sacrifice to a goddess, and she sent a boar into his country, a monstrous one that ruined the orchards and the vines, and every hero alive came to hunt it. There was a woman in that hunt who drew first blood, and a young prince who gave her the hide because of it, and a family quarrel over the honor that ended with the prince dead by his own mother's hand. The strongest man in the world had a boar among his labors, and the joke of that story is that he does not kill it. He chases it into deep snow until it is exhausted and carries it back alive on his shoulders, and the king who set him the task hides in a storage jar when he sees it coming. And then there is the god's favorite in the east, the beautiful young man loved by the goddess of desire, who went hunting against her advice and was killed by a boar with a wound in the thigh, and from whose blood a flower came up, and who was mourned every year by women on the rooftops of Greek cities in the heat of summer, with little gardens of seed planted in pots that sprouted fast and died faster. Same animal, same wound, different outcomes. To ancient listeners, this would have been a familiar rhyme rather than a coincidence. The boar is what the wild does to a young man who goes into it, and the difference between the hero and the rest is not whether he is marked, but whether he comes back. Ours comes back. That is the whole distinction, and the poem states it in the plainest way possible. The tusk took flesh and missed the bone, and 40 years later, he is sitting in his own house with an old woman's hands on the evidence. But there is one more thing about scars, and it is not literary at all. And I find it the most quietly astonishing fact in tonight's subject. In the ancient world, a scar was your identity document. We know this because we have the paperwork. From Egypt, in the centuries after Alexander, thousands of documents written on papyrus have survived in the dry sand. Contracts, loans, marriage agreements, tax receipts, land sales, apprenticeship papers, court complaints. Ordinary life in enormous quantity, and in those documents, when a person has to be identified, they are described. Name, father's name, age, height, complexion, and then over and over the same category of detail. A scar on the left eyebrow, a scar on the right wrist, a scar in the middle of the forehead, a scar below the knee. That is how a person was pinned down in a world with no photographs, no signatures that most people could produce, no numbers assigned at birth. Two men with the same name in the same village were distinguished by where they had been cut. Think about what that means for the scene we have been sitting in. When a Greek audience heard that an old woman put her hands on a mark and knew who she was holding, they were not hearing a poetic device. They were hearing the standard legal procedure of their own world, performed by touch in the dark, by somebody who had known the body since it was new. The scar is the passport, and unlike everything else this man carries, his name, his story, his accent, his clothes, his face after 20 years of sun and salt, it cannot be exchanged for another one. And here is the thought underneath all of it, and it is the reason this story sits so oddly and so beautifully in the middle of a poem about a man who can be anybody. He is the great shape changer of Greek legend without ever changing shape. Others turn into animals. He simply becomes another person again and again, and does it so well that gods enjoy watching. And the whole apparatus is defeated by his own body, which has been quietly keeping the record the entire time. That is what a body does. It is the one part of a person that will not participate in the story he is telling about himself. It logs what happened. The hands thicken, the back goes, the knee remembers a fall from 30 years ago on cold mornings, and a piece of skin above the knee stays a slightly different texture for the rest of a life. He is a man who has spent 20 years outrunning the consequences of a single sentence he shouted across a stretch of water. He has changed his name, his country, his clothes, his story, his voice. He has been nobody, and the flesh has been carrying the whole account, unedited, the entire time, and hands it over to the first person who touches him properly. One more observation about bodies before we finish. Because this poem is unusually interested in them, and it is not a coincidence. Look at who the second half is populated by. An old servant with knees that will not do what she tells them on the stairs, a dog too weak to stand, lying on a heap of dung, covered in ticks. Who does the one thing nobody else manages? An old man out on a farm in patched clothes and a goatskin cap, with gloves against the brambles, digging around a plant. A man in his 40s who has been at sea and at war for 2 decades. And who is described, when the disguise is taken off, as needing a goddess to make him look presentable. And the transformations themselves are described physically, in detail. The skin shriveled on the limbs, the hair gone from the head, the eyes dimmed, and then later put back, with the hair curling like a hyacinth flower, and grace poured over the shoulders. The poem keeps returning to what time does to a body, and it does it in a story whose central character is famous for pretending to be other people. That is not decoration. It is the argument. Every disguise in this poem is a claim about the surface, and the surface is the one thing that is genuinely changeable. By dirt, by rags, by a goddess, by 20 years of weather. What does not change is the record underneath, the scar, the tree count in a garden, a bed with a root under it. There is a reason the recognitions that work are the ones that involve two people and a shared past, and the ones that fail are the ones that rely on somebody looking at somebody else. There is a last thing to say about the old woman, because the poem does not forget her, and neither should we. She keeps the secret. That is not nothing. For days, in a house where she is the person everybody talks to, with 24 young men eating in the hall and 50 women under her authority, and a mistress upstairs whom she loves and has served for 20 years. She says nothing, and when it is over, and she comes into the hall and finds him standing there, she opens her mouth to raise the cry of triumph, and he stops her. The line he gives her is one I have thought about a great deal. Rejoice in your heart, old woman, and hold still, and do not cry out. It is not right to exult over men who have been killed. Then he sends her upstairs to wake his wife, and she goes up the stairs so fast that her knees keep getting ahead of themselves, and stands over the bed and says the thing she has been holding since the night of the basin. She is the first person in that house to know, and the last one allowed to say it. And after that, the poem lets her go. She has a line or two more, organizing the cleaning of the hall, telling the women to bring fire and sulfur, and then she is gone from the story. A woman bought for the price of 20 oxen 70 years earlier, who nursed 2 generations, who ran a household through 20 years of siege by other people's sons, who identified her master by touch in the dark and then kept her mouth shut about it because he asked her to. Now let us go back into that little room one last time, and then we can put the whole thing down. It is late. The hall next door is quiet. The water has already been mopped up, and the basin has been refilled and used and taken away. And there is a damp patch on the stone floor that is drying at the edges and will be gone by morning. The rags are back over the leg. He is sitting where he was, turned toward the fire again now, because there is no longer any reason to sit in the dark. The old woman has gone to bed. Somewhere above them, a woman is lying awake in an upstairs room, not knowing or not letting herself know. And on a mountain in the middle of Greece, 400 miles and 40 years away, there is a hollow with a thicket in it, where no wind gets and no rain and no sun. And there is a heap of dead leaves inside it, and there is nothing there at all anymore. The old thief is long dead. The uncles are dead. The dogs are dead. The boar has been dead since the morning it happened. All of it is gone except one ridge of tissue on a man's leg, which is the last remaining piece of a wet morning in the mountains when he was young and quick and did not think about anything for very long. That is what a scar is in the end, not a wound. A wound closed. The body's way of writing down that something happened here and then getting on with the business of being alive. You will have your own. Most people do by a certain age. A white line on a knuckle, something on a knee from a bicycle, a mark from an operation, a place that aches before rain. If you put your hand on one of them now in the dark, you will find that it comes with a whole afternoon attached, complete, with the weather in it and somebody's voice. That is all this poem is describing. It just gave it 70 lines and a mountain. Let the room go quiet. The fire is a low red heap now with the shapes still glowing in it. There is the smell of wet stone drying, and of oil, and of the sulfur somebody burned to clean the room, which is sharp and strange, and means the end of something. Outside there is the sea, going about its business on the rocks under the town in the dark, as it has every night of the 20 years and every night since. Nothing has to be recognized tonight. Nobody is testing you. You do not have to prove who you are to anybody, and there is no one at the door. Let your hands rest wherever they are. Let the breath go out slowly, and let the next one come without being asked for. Sleep well.